Now that we understand the fundamental movements of the mind, how do I drop a thought? How do I pick up a thought? How do I hold on to the thought? The fact still remains, we don't quite understand where thoughts come from, right? So we know what to do with them and how to sort of control them, but we still don't understand the origin of thoughts. So in order to understand where the right thoughts come from and where the wrong thoughts come from, we have to understand the origin of thoughts themselves. So thoughts tend to come from three places. And the first place they come from is the Indriyas, or the sense organs. So I want you all to think about, the last show that you were excited to watch, or the last movie that you were really excited about, or maybe you're excited about that's going to be coming out soon. So just think about that show or movie for a second. Were people 2,000 years ago just as excited as you are about that movie? And then you may sort of say like, well, obviously, duh, like, no, of course they weren't. And then the question is, hold on a second, the question is why? Why weren't people 2,000 years ago excited about, the next Star Wars movie or Marvel movie or whatever, the next video game coming out, next album that you're looking forward to? Why weren't they excited about it 2,000 years ago? Because it's pretty hype, right? Like, it's pretty cool that this thing is coming out and like everyone's talking about it and it's like really fantastic. And if it's so objectively fantastic and so excitable, like, why weren't they excited about it 2,000 years ago? And you're like, obviously, like, idiot, like, no, of course they weren't excited about it. And why not? Because they had never heard of it. So stop for a second, think about that. So if you really think about what makes you excited, where did that originate from? It originated from your sense organs. So in order to be excited about something, in order to be motivated to watch something, you have to hear about it first, right? Obviously. It has to enter your consciousness, it has to enter your awareness through your sense organs. Now, this is a really, really important point, because what this sort of suggests to us is that if we're careful about our sense organs and how to control our sense organs, what we'll actually do is cultivate the right kinds of thoughts. This is something that we sort of even understand as a society as a whole. It's sort of taken for granted, but we don't quite apply it to our personal lives in terms of cultivating the right kinds of thoughts. So societally, we know that there's the field of advertising, right? And what is the goal of the field of advertising? It is to actually populate your mind with particular thoughts. That's what they're literally paid to do. So they create an advertisement. And what is an advertisement? It's a sensory input. So what they've sort of figured out is that if we create the right kind of sensory input, it will create the right kind of thought in your head. If we can manipulate the thoughts in your head, what we will do is manipulate your behavior. Now, this is really important to understand, because if we sort of really understand how this process works, which is exactly what the yogis did, they sort of figured this out a couple thousand years ago, that the thoughts in our head come from our sensory impressions. We sort of know this scientifically as well. So we have lots of studies on groups like, for example, Alcoholics Anonymous. And we know that getting sober from alcohol is very difficult. And so what do we sort of encourage people to do if they want to get sober from alcohol? Is it to spend time with people at bars and hanging out drinking? No, it's actually quite the opposite. It's to spend time in a situation where your sensory input is different. So if we think about a bar versus an AA meeting, the sensory inputs of those two places are very different. Like, fundamentally, what's the difference? It's sensorily what you get exposed to, right? You hear different things, you smell different things, you taste different things. And so by cultivating the right kind of sensory environment, we know that we can alter thought and alter behavior. It's not just AA, though. So we also know, for example, nowadays there are these things called startup incubators. And so what's the point of a startup incubator? It's to create a particular kind of environment that cultivates a particular kind of thought and motivation. So when I'm part of a startup incubator, what's going to happen is I'm going to get excited about startup stuff. I'm going to talk to other people who will also sort of like get me kind of excited. It'll build my motivation, and then I can work on my startup in a very productive way. So we sort of know, in a sense, scientifically, that cultivating the right kind of environment, and that's where we have to make the next step, which is like, what is environment? Environment is simply a group of sensory impressions. And so we sort of know this scientifically, that this works, that putting yourself in the right kind of environment will create particular kinds of sensory impressions, and by creating those kinds of sensory impressions will actually create a particular kind of thought. And this is why we're sort of going into this, because it's not really the environment itself. If we really tunnel down to the individual level, It is the sensory impressions which create the thought. And armed with this knowledge, armed with sort of the understanding of, that senses create thoughts, we will now have a fundamental variable in the equation of creating the right kind of thought. And once we understand what kind of thoughts we want to create and we understand how to manage those thoughts, that's what will ultimately lead to success. This is where we've got to sort of move on to the next thing, which is that thoughts don't just come from pure sensory impressions. The way that our mind works, our mind also attaches things to the sensory impressions. So let's take the example of a child who grows up in a toxic household. So when a child is growing up in a toxic household, they get told particular things. Maybe they get told harsh things that are kind of traumatic. People say very mean things to them. But that's not just a simple kind of auditory stimulus, right? When someone says something mean to me, that sensory impression gets laid down in our memory. And when it gets laid down in our memory, we actually attach particular emotions to it. This is also something that's very, very important to understand. If we think about sensory impressions come with some kind of association. And it is the formation of that association which will actually generate particular kinds of thoughts. So if we take, for example, two stimuli that are exactly the same. Let's say I'm a fully grown adult and someone calls me an idiot. Now, that sensory input can be exactly the same whether I'm a fully formed adult or I'm a 5-year-old child. But the emotional impact, the emotional association with that sensory input is actually different for the adult versus the child. And that's something that's really important to understand, because when one of those sensory inputs gets laid down into our memory, that will generate different kinds of thoughts. So when a child grows up in a toxic household, it's not just the words that are spoken, but the emotional impact which gets stored in our mind and then generates thoughts, right? So if a child is grown up and told, hey, you're awesome, you can do anything that you want to accomplish in the world, you're the best person in the world, that child will grow up to be arrogant and entitled. And if a child is told, oh, you're an absolute piece of crap, you're not going to accomplish anything, that child will grow up to have self-esteem problems. And arrogance and self-esteem problems, what are those actually in the mind? They are particular thoughts, right? A thought that I deserve this or I don't deserve this. And those kinds of thoughts then will shape their behavior in terms of, are they going to apply for promotion? Are they not going to apply for promotion? Are they going to ask someone out on a date? Are they not going to ask someone out on a date? Do they feel entitled to that promotion or to that date? Or do they feel undeserving? And then suddenly we can see how these thoughts that come from sensory impressions with emotional attachments can lead to particular actions and can shape the course of your life. But the fundamental building block is still something that we want to focus on, which is simply that a sensory impression gets attached to an emotional kind of impact, and that gets laid down, and that sort of becomes a thought-generating machine in our mind, and then we'll populate our mind with our thoughts. So if we want the right kind of thought to pop up in our mind, what we really need to do is pay attention to the process of sensory input, as well as how our mind interprets and lays down that sensory input, the emotions that get attached with it. And we sort of also understand the significance of this in psychotherapy, which is when what we actually do is we recall sensory experiences, and what we do is digest the emotion that comes with the sensory experience. And the cool thing is that by digesting the emotion, we shape that person's thoughts going forward. So if someone comes in and has self-esteem problems, by doing something like psychotherapy with them, by digesting those emotional impressions, we actually alter their thinking and thus alter their behavior. There's a third place that thoughts come from, and this is going to sound a little bit mystical, but we sort of have to include it for completeness. And that is transcendental thought. So as the yogis were looking at this process, and as they sort of figured out, what they did is they observed a thought in their head, and they asked themselves, where does this thought come from? And they realized, it comes from a sensory impression. And then they also realized that whenever they have sensory impressions, they get attached with emotions and stored in the mind. And then that complex of sensory organ plus emotion can kind of populate your mind with thoughts. They realized there's a third place that thoughts come from, which has nothing to do with sensory impressions or emotions. And that is what I'm going to call transcendental thought. So as they approached areas of kind of meditation, higher states of consciousness and all that kind of good stuff, what they sort of discovered was that from this other place, they would sometimes get thoughts. And the simplest way to understand this is kind of like a flash of inspiration or creativity. So sometimes as human beings, we'll kind of connect dots or things will sort of make sense to us. But those things can't really be tied to a particular sensory experience or kind of the memory of a sensory experience. And I'm not saying this to kind of be like mystical, but really it's just important to understand that as we meditate and as we cultivate particular states of mind, we will start to have thoughts that originate from like other places rather than sensory organs. And so we can use sensory organs to sort of patch things together, right? So we can sort of like, I don't know how to say this, but we can create a new story from old archetypes. But there are some times where we have a truly original idea, which seems kind of revolutionary. And if you talk to people or work with artists who will sort of describe their process, it almost comes from the outside. And this is where even the word genius comes from this kind of idea that true genius is not a person, but is something that affects you, is sort of a temporary state of mind of kind of like a higher level of understanding. And that's what we're going to call transcendent thought. Now, transcendent thought is fantastic, don't get me wrong. We're not going to be focusing too much on it because it's actually very hard to achieve. It's sort of like an end result of extensive meditation or other kinds of creative processes. It doesn't have to be meditation. But the reason that we want to include it is for the sake of completeness, right? So we're going to be focusing a lot on sensory impressions and emotions that get tied to sensory impressions, but we also want to acknowledge for a moment that there's a third place that these thoughts can come from, which is sort of transcendent thought. So just to kind of summarize, if we want to act in the right way, if we want to shape our lives in the right way, that ultimately comes down to our thoughts. And shaping our thoughts in the right way involves two major things. The first is, how do we manage thoughts? How do we manipulate them? How do we hold them, pick them up, put them down? And the second thing is understanding the origin of thoughts. So where do thoughts come from in the first place? And so where thoughts come from, fundamentally and most simply, is our sensory impressions. This is exactly why 2,000 years ago, no one was excited about this new restaurant that's opening up down the street from where you live, because they had never heard of it, right? So thoughts in our mind come from what we see, what we hear, what we smell, what we taste. And then the second thing is that when we have some kind of sensory impression, oftentimes it gets attached with a particular emotion. And this is why people get triggered, right? The emotion that they get triggered with comes from a sensory impression. If I've been traumatized by a dog or a cat or a bear or a moose, seeing one of those animals again will bring up those emotions, will bring up those fears, and will bring up those anxieties. So if we want to control those fears, control those anxieties, we have to understand where they originated from and what the process is of populating our mind with our fears. And that fundamentally comes from sensory organs and emotional impressions that are attached to sensory organs. And then just for the sake of completeness, the third place that thoughts can come from is from this sort of transcendent state of consciousness, which kind of feels like the light bulb going off in your head, where everything kind of clicks, or what we can sort of call creative inspiration. So now that we understand the importance of senses for creating thoughts, the next natural step is to train our sensory organs. The more that we train our sensory organs, the more that we will sort of create a filter or a control on what thoughts will populate our mind.